Food can be a source of comfort and survival, but it can also become deadly when preparation or identification goes wrong. 6 people made ordinary food choices that proved fatal, consuming contaminated meals that overwhelmed their bodies with bacterial infections, botulism toxins, and deadly compounds. These are their stories. It was June 17, 2017, at a Baptist church in rural Georgia. The fellowship hall buzzed with the familiar energy of the monthly potluck, where recipes were shared like family secrets, and every dish told a story. In this close-knit community where everyone knew each other's cooking, hidden ingredients could prove more dangerous than anyone imagined. Dorothy Mae Williams, 63, had served as church secretary for 8 years following her husband's death. Her severe peanut allergy required constant vigilance. She carried an epinephrine auto-injector everywhere. 2 previous anaphylactic reactions had landed her in the hospital, the most recent occurring 3 years earlier after consuming a cookie containing peanut flour. Williams prepared her signature potato salad for the monthly potluck dinner scheduled for 6 p.m. The recipe contained mayonnaise, hard-boiled eggs, diced celery, and red potatoes, the same combination she had made dozens of times without incident. She took pride in her cooking and had won the church's annual recipe contest 3 consecutive years. During dinner service at 6 p.m., Williams ate her usual portion alongside dishes from other congregation members. The fellowship hall buzzed with conversation as 45 church members enjoyed the monthly gathering. During the dinner, no one mentioned any ingredient changes. The rolls looked like any other batch the church had served before. The detail about peanut oil only surfaced later during the post-incident review of the food items. 15 minutes after eating, Williams felt itching around her mouth and throat. Church member Robert Hayes, 51, watched her scratch repeatedly at her neck and face. Williams dismissed the sensation as seasonal allergies and gestured that her throat felt scratchy. Within 5 minutes, visible hives erupted across her face and neck. Her voice became hoarse, and Hayes noticed audible wheezing as Williams struggled to breathe. She reached for her purse to find her epinephrine auto-injector, but couldn't locate it in the crowded bag. Hayes called for help as Williams' breathing became more labored. Pastor Johnson approached the table, recognizing the signs of a medical emergency. Williams tried to speak, but could only produce a whispered rasp as her airway continued to swell. At 6:32 p.m., Williams collapsed from her chair onto the fellowship hall floor and stopped breathing entirely. Her face had turned blue, and she slumped forward with no apparent muscle control. Emergency services were contacted immediately, while Pastor Johnson began checking for a pulse. Paramedics arrived at 6:48 p.m. Their report described her as unresponsive, with no measurable pulse or blood pressure and severe swelling that made airway access nearly impossible. Hives covered much of her upper body. Her lips and fingernails had turned blue from lack of oxygen. Paramedics immediately administered epinephrine and attempted intubation, but severe swelling prevented the breathing tube from being inserted. Despite multiple doses of epinephrine, antihistamines, and steroids, Williams remained in cardiac arrest. The paramedics worked for nearly an hour, performing CPR and administering medications. Church members gathered in the parking lot, praying and waiting for news. By the time the last resuscitation attempt failed at 7:25 p.m., Williams had been without a heartbeat for nearly an hour. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as anaphylactic shock from peanut exposure. During the review of the scene, investigators found her epinephrine auto-injector inside her purse and noted it had expired 6 months earlier. Laboratory testing on the leftover food items detected peanut protein on both the dinner rolls and the portion recovered from her plate, confirming the source of exposure. Investigators later identified the person who prepared the rolls as 54-year-old Sarah Mitchell, a longtime church member. She told them she had used peanut oil in the recipe, but had been unaware of Williams' severe allergy. It was July 4th, 2016, in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The annual neighborhood barbecue was in full swing, with Dave Patterson holding court at his massive grill like a conductor leading an orchestra. In his element as the self-appointed king of backyard cooking, even the most experienced grill master could let enthusiasm override caution. Dave Patterson, 42, sold insurance and had hosted neighborhood barbecues annually for 6 consecutive years. He took pride in his reputation as the neighborhood grill master. Patterson had a documented history of rapid eating and previous choking episodes, including one incident 2 years prior that required his wife's intervention to dislodge food. Patterson spent the morning preparing massive beef ribs, seasoning them with his signature dry rub, and slow cooking them for 6 hours. Each portion weighed 8 to 10 ounces with substantial amounts of meat attached to thick bones. The barbecue began at 4 p.m., with Patterson engaged in animated discussions about local sports teams while eating and drinking beer. Neighbors gathered in his backyard, enjoying the pool and elaborate spread of food. Witnesses observed his pattern of talking extensively while consuming food rapidly without proper chewing. Patterson was known for his storytelling ability and often held court during gatherings, gesturing with food in his hands. He had consumed 3 beers over 2 hours, which may have affected his awareness of proper chewing. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Patterson bit off a large piece of rib meat while laughing heartily at neighbor Jim Rodriguez's joke. The meat portion was estimated to be approximately 2 inches in diameter with tough, fibrous texture from the slow cooking process. Patterson immediately began choking, dropping his beer and grabbing his throat with both hands. Rodriguez and other neighbors watched in horror as his face turned red, then purple, then blue as he lost the ability to speak, cough, or breathe. Rodriguez stepped behind Patterson and delivered 5 forceful back blows between the shoulder blades, following standard choking protocol. When the obstruction didn't shift, he attempted abdominal thrusts next. The thrusts failed to dislodge the obstruction. A retired nurse arrived moments later and continued the 5 back blows, 5 abdominal thrusts cycle with proper technique, but the obstruction still didn't move. As Patterson began losing consciousness, the retired nurse prepared to begin CPR, but he collapsed before effective compressions could be started. Patterson collapsed to his knees on the concrete patio, then fell forward. The nurse repositioned him to attempt CPR, while Rodriguez called 911. Other neighbors cleared the area as Patterson remained unresponsive. Emergency services received the call at 5:33 p.m. Paramedics arrived at 5:49 p.m., finding Patterson unconscious and not breathing. Paramedics noted an obstruction deep in the upper airway, but it was positioned below clear visualization and out of reach of standard removal tools. With no airflow detected and the obstruction inaccessible from above, paramedics proceeded with an emergency cricothyrotomy to attempt to establish a secondary airway. However, Patterson had been without oxygen for over 15 minutes. They inserted a breathing tube and began ventilation while performing chest compressions. The paramedics worked for over 45 minutes, administering cardiac drugs. Patterson's wife arrived during the resuscitation efforts, having been called by neighbors. Despite all efforts, Patterson's heart never resumed beating. The prolonged lack of oxygen had caused irreversible brain damage and cardiac arrest. Autopsy revealed death by asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. The obstructing piece of meat measured 2.1 inches in diameter and had completely blocked Patterson's trachea. The medical examiner noted that alcohol consumption may have impaired Patterson's swallowing reflexes. It was November 15, 2015, behind a grocery store in Portland, Oregon. The homeless encampment was a patchwork of survival strategies where veterans like Thomas Roger used military discipline to navigate civilian hardships. Thomas Roger, 29, lived in a tent encampment along the Willamette River 8 months after his discharge from the Army, following 2 tours in Afghanistan. The former combat medic struggled with employment due to documented PTSD. Camp residents knew Roger regularly scavenged discarded food from grocery store dumpsters, often sharing his finds with other homeless individuals. Behind the grocery store on November 15th, Roger discovered a sealed plastic container of what appeared to be homemade chicken and rice soup. The container had been discarded with other food waste from a nearby restaurant that had experienced refrigeration problems over the weekend. Unknown to Roger, the soup contained chicken that had been contaminated with salmonella during processing. The restaurant had discarded the soup after discovering their walk-in cooler had malfunctioned, allowing the contaminated poultry to reach dangerous temperatures for over 24 hours. Roger consumed 2 cups of the soup around 6 p.m., heating it over a small camping stove. Camp resident Maria Santos observed Roger eating the soup and noted that he seemed to enjoy the warm meal after several days of cold food. 12 hours later, Roger experienced severe abdominal cramping and frequent diarrhea. Santos found him doubled over with intense pain and watery bowel movements occurring every hour. Roger complained of feeling weak and had developed a fever. Over the following 48 hours, Roger's condition deteriorated as severe dehydration set in. Living outdoors without access to clean water or medical care, he was unable to replace fluids lost through constant diarrhea and vomiting. His fever climbed as the infection spread to his bloodstream. By November 18th, Roger had developed septic shock as the bacterial infection overwhelmed his weakened immune system. Santos contacted emergency services at 2:30 p.m. when Roger became delirious and showed signs of severe dehydration and confusion. Paramedics arrived at 2:45 p.m., finding Roger semi-conscious with gray, dry skin and dangerously low blood pressure consistent with septic shock. His pulse was rapid and weak, and his breathing was shallow. Roger was transported to the regional hospital where he received emergency treatment, including intravenous fluids and antibiotics. However, the salmonella infection had progressed to septicemia, and his weakened immune system from months of malnutrition could not fight the overwhelming infection. Blood tests confirmed a severe salmonella infection that had already advanced into septic shock. Despite immediate fluids, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and vasopressor support, his blood pressure never stabilized. The infection was overwhelming his organs. His kidneys failed from dehydration and poor circulation, and his heart could no longer maintain adequate output. The medical team continued treatment, but the systemic infection had progressed too far for reversal. He showed irreversible organ damage, consistent with late-stage septic shock. He died 4 days after eating the contaminated soup after septic shock and multi-organ failure overwhelmed his system. The official cause of death was listed as septic shock with multi-organ failure. Laboratory analysis later confirmed Salmonella enteritis in his blood cultures. His prolonged malnutrition, constant exposure to the cold, and delayed access to medical care had left his body unable to fight the infection. It was September 22nd, 2018, at a rural farmhouse in Iowa. The kitchen was Susan Miller's domain, where she transformed garden abundance into winter security with the methodical precision of a woman determined to stretch every dollar. Susan Miller, 44, stayed home raising 3 children while managing type 1 diabetes diagnosed 15 years earlier. Poor glucose control had hospitalized her twice in the past year for diabetic ketoacidosis. Recent medication rationing due to financial constraints had left her in a weakened state. Following her husband Mark's job loss, Miller had begun preserving garden vegetables to reduce household expenses. She had successfully canned tomatoes and pickles earlier, but had limited experience with low-acid vegetables like green beans. Miller used a water bath canning method instead of the required pressure canning technique. On September 20th, Miller opened a jar of green beans she had canned 3 weeks earlier. The beans appeared normal with a proper seal and color, showing no obvious signs of spoilage. However, the improper canning method had created anaerobic conditions perfect for botulism spore growth. Miller prepared the beans by briefly warming them in a saucepan for less than 2 minutes, not reaching sufficient temperature or duration to destroy botulism toxin. She consumed approximately 1 cup of the lightly warmed beans, along with her normal dinner. The green beans contained botulism toxin, produced by Clostridium botulinum bacteria that had grown in the improperly canned environment. The brief, low-temperature heating had not reached the 185 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 minutes required to neutralize the potent neurotoxin. 18 hours later, Miller began experiencing difficulty swallowing and blurred vision. Her husband Mark noted her slurred speech and drooping eyelids. Miller initially attributed the symptoms to blood sugar fluctuations. By September 22nd, muscle weakness had progressed from her face downward, affecting her ability to speak clearly and hold objects. The classic descending paralysis of botulism was becoming apparent as toxins blocked nerve signals to her muscles. September 23rd brought severe breathing difficulties as the toxin paralyzed Miller's respiratory muscles. Mark immediately called emergency services at 1:45 p.m. when he found her struggling to breathe and unable to speak. Paramedics arrived at 2 p.m., finding Miller with severe muscle weakness, difficulty breathing, and classic signs of descending paralysis consistent with botulism poisoning. Her respiratory muscles were failing rapidly. Miller was transported to the regional hospital, where physicians administered botulism antitoxin and placed her on mechanical ventilation. However, the toxin had already caused significant nerve damage, and her respiratory paralysis was too advanced for the antitoxin to reverse. Despite intensive treatment and mechanical breathing support, Miller's condition continued deteriorating. The botulism toxin had caused widespread paralysis of muscles essential for breathing and circulation. Her weakened diabetic condition complicated treatment as her body struggled to fight the effects of the neurotoxin. Blood sugar levels became increasingly difficult to control as her body's systems failed. On September 28th at 4:20 a.m., 6 days after symptom onset, Susan Miller's breathing stopped entirely despite mechanical support. The woman who had tried to save money by preserving her own food had been killed by the improperly canned green beans. Death resulted from respiratory failure caused by botulism poisoning. Laboratory analysis confirmed the presence of Clostridium botulinum toxin in both Miller's blood and the remaining canned green beans. The water bath canning method had been insufficient to kill botulism spores in the low-acid vegetables. It was October 14th, 2016, in a national forest in northern Michigan. The woods were Robert Kellerman's new classroom, where unemployment had transformed him from a factory worker to forager with the determination of a man refusing to accept defeat. Robert Kellerman, 49, had lost his auto worker job 6 weeks earlier as part of a workforce reduction. The layoff had eliminated his family's primary income, and he turned to mushroom foraging for food budget supplementation. Library books provided his only identification knowledge. He lacked formal mycology training. Kellerman had been foraging for 2 months and had successfully identified and consumed puffballs, oyster mushrooms, and honey mushrooms without incident, which increased his confidence. In a mixed hardwood area, Kellerman discovered a cluster of white mushrooms growing near a large oak tree. The mushrooms were approximately 3 to 4 inches in diameter with white caps and stems, matching his mental image of edible puffballs. Laboratory testing later confirmed the mushrooms were destroying angels containing lethal amatoxins. Destroying angels have gills underneath their caps and grow from a bulbous base, while puffballs have solid white interiors without gills. Kellerman failed to make these critical distinctions. His wife, Natasha, observed the mushrooms when he returned home and immediately noted they appeared different from previous finds. She specifically mentioned the visible gills underneath the caps, which she remembered from a television program about mushroom safety. Natasha suggested Kellerman consult his field guides more carefully. Kellerman dismissed his wife's concerns, stating he had been successfully foraging for 2 months without problems. He prepared approximately 8 ounces of the mushrooms by sautéing them in butter and garlic for dinner, consuming the entire portion. Natasha declined to eat them due to her concerns. 8 hours after consumption, both Kellerman and his wife experienced severe nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Natasha had consumed a small amount during cooking. The symptoms lasted approximately 12 hours, with both experiencing dehydration and weakness. By October 16th, both felt significantly better, following the typical pattern of amatoxin poisoning where victims experience temporary improvement before liver damage becomes apparent. This false recovery period often leads victims to believe they have recovered from simple food poisoning. During this phase, the amatoxins were causing progressive liver damage that would become life-threatening within 48 to 72 hours. Amatoxins block the liver's ability to produce essential proteins, causing widespread cell death. October 17th brought jaundice and severe abdominal pain for Kellerman. His wife noted yellowing of his skin and eyes and his inability to keep food down. She had similar initial symptoms, but was recovering, having consumed much less. Kellerman's condition was clearly more severe. Emergency services were contacted at 2:30 p.m. when Kellerman's condition deteriorated rapidly. Paramedics found him in severe distress with obvious jaundice, abdominal distension, and altered mental status consistent with liver failure. Hospital blood tests confirmed severe liver damage with elevated enzymes and bilirubin levels, indicating complete liver dysfunction. Treatment included activated charcoal and supportive care. but liver function continued deteriorating. The hospital contacted specialists about potential liver transplantation, but Kellerman's condition was too unstable. He developed hepatic encephalopathy with severe confusion as toxins accumulated in his bloodstream. By October 20th, Robert Kellerman's liver had failed completely. 6 days after consuming the misidentified mushrooms, his organs could no longer function. Death resulted from acute liver failure caused by amatoxin poisoning. Laboratory testing confirmed the presence of alpha-amanitin in both blood and tissue samples at lethal concentrations. Kellerman's wife survived, though the smaller amount she tasted left her with permanent liver damage requiring ongoing treatment. In the months that followed, state natural resources departments increased mushroom identification warning signage throughout the region to prevent similar incidents. It was December 17, 2017, on a quiet stretch of highway outside Detroit, Michigan. Freezing air pushed across the empty industrial corridor, and thin sheets of black ice formed under intermittent streetlights. Angela Torres drove home after another overnight ICU shift, her sedan moving steadily through the early morning dark. Torres, 29, had been covering holiday staffing gaps for weeks, stacking long shifts with minimal sleep. Co-worker reports later confirmed she relied heavily on stimulants to stay alert. Energy drinks during charting, caffeine tablets at the start of each shift, and strong coffee through the night. Hospital logs and time cards showed she had worked nearly 22 hours before clocking out that morning. At 2:15 a.m., surveillance footage from a convenience store captured her buying 3 large energy drinks and a bottle of caffeine pills during a brief stop on her way home. She consumed very little food during the shift, allowing the stimulants to absorb faster. The drinks she purchased each contained about 300 milligrams of caffeine, and the pills added even more. Combined, her estimated intake for the day would later reach more than 2,700 milligrams, an amount capable of triggering dangerous cardiac rhythms, even in healthy adults. Torres had an undiagnosed case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a genetic thickening of the heart muscle associated with sudden cardiac arrest under physical or chemical stress. Her father had died suddenly at 35, a detail that would only gain meaning afterward. With the heavy stimulant load entering her bloodstream and little rest to stabilize her physiology, her heart was under extreme strain as she left the convenience store and merged back onto the interstate. Around 3:20 a.m., a motorist traveling in the right lane noticed a sedan ahead drifting slowly toward the shoulder. The car's brake lights flickered once before the vehicle glided into a shallow snowbank along the guardrail. The impact was gentle, barely audible from the road, but the car remained idling in place with the driver's silhouette slumped forward. The witness pulled over and approached cautiously, calling 911 when the driver did not respond to tapping on the window. The state police arrived shortly after the call. Finding the doors locked and the driver unresponsive, officers broke a rear window to gain access. Angela Torres was found with no pulse and shallow cyanosis around her mouth, consistent with several minutes of cardiac arrest. Officers immediately began CPR until emergency medical services arrived. Paramedics attached a monitor that registered ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, ineffective rhythm often triggered by high doses of stimulants. Multiple defibrillation attempts produced no organized heartbeat. Torres was loaded into the ambulance and transported to a nearby medical facility, where resuscitation efforts continued but did not restore circulation. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Toxicology would later show caffeine and ephedrine levels within lethal ranges, and autopsy findings confirmed the undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that had made the stimulant surge especially dangerous. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.